The wealthy rancher rode into the valley just after sunrise, when the fog still clung to the ground like a reluctant ghost. His horse's hooves struck the dirt road with practiced confidence, each step echoing his purpose. He had made this ride dozens of times before, arriving unannounced, collecting what was owed, leaving without looking back. Debt was debt. Mercy, he believed, was a weakness best left to poorer men. The land he was crossing had once been promising. Wide fields stretched on either side of the road, but now they lay thin and neglected. Fences sagged, their posts rotting into the soil. A broken windmill leaned at an angle, its blades frozen as if time itself had abandoned the place. The rancher recognized the signs immediately. This was land that had lost its caretaker. The debt belonged to a man named Thomas Hale, a farmer who had borrowed heavily during a drought season. Thomas had promised repayment once the rains returned, but the rains had come too late. A fever swept through the valley the following winter, and Thomas never recovered. When payments stopped, the account passed automatically into the rancher's hands. Death, after all, did not cancel contracts. As the rancher approached the homestead, he expected anger, or at least negotiation. Instead, what greeted him was silence. The house stood small and worn, its paint peeling like old. 5 of them stood near the fence, watching him as if he were a storm rolling in. Their clothes were mismatched and threadbare, hanging loose on thin frames. One child clutched another's hand, while the smallest hid behind a post, peeking out with wide, uncertain eyes. They did not run. They did not speak. They simply watched, silent and afraid. The sight unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He had faced grown men who cursed. The widow invited the rancher inside, not with words, but with a small step backward and a hand resting on the open door. The gesture carried no warmth, only necessity. He hesitated, then followed, ducking slightly as he crossed the low threshold. Inside, the house felt colder than the morning air outside, though a weak fire crackled in the hearth. The single room told the story she had not yet spoken. A rough wooden table stood in the center, one leg shorter than the others, balanced by a folded scrap of cloth. 2 chairs remained, both repaired more than once, their joints bound with wire. Against the far wall, a narrow shelf held a few tin cups, a chipped bowl, and a sack that looked far too light to be full. The smell of thin porridge lingered in the air. The children followed quietly. She paused, then straightened her shoulders. "But my children will eat before any debt is paid. That much I will not apologize for." The rancher felt the weight of her words settle heavily between them. He had heard many excuses in his life, stories of bad luck, false promises, angry accusations, but this was not an excuse. It was a declaration. Survival came first. As he looked closer, he noticed the details he had missed before. Her hands were rough and scarred, not the hands of a woman who had been sheltered by a husband, but of one who had taken on every task herself. A bruise darkened her forearm, likely from chopping wood or lifting something too heavy. The lines beneath her eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent listening for a sick child's breath or counting coins that never added up. One of the children coughed, a sharp, dry sound that echoed in the room. The widow's head snapped toward him instantly. She crossed the room in 2 strides, placing a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder, murmuring reassurance. The cough passed, but the fear in her eyes did not. "He gets weak in the cold," she said quietly, not looking at the rancher. "The doctor is 2 days right away. I pray he won't be needed." For the first time, the rancher felt something twist painfully in his chest. This debt was no longer ink on a ledger. It was a choice. The rancher did not ride far. Instead of returning to his estate before nightfall, he set up camp on a low ridge overlooking the valley, close enough to see the widow's homestead but far enough to keep his distance. He told himself it was practical. He would observe the land, calculate its worth, decide whether the debt could be settled through seizure. Yet as darkness fell, he knew the truth was harder to face. Something had rooted him there. At dawn, he watched smoke rise from the chimney once more, thin and uncertain, as if even the fire was rationed. The widow emerged early. Unable to ignore the thought, he rode down through the rain. He told himself he was protecting his investment, but the lie rang hollow. When he reached the house, he found the widow on the roof, soaked through, struggling to secure a loose board while the children huddled inside. Without a word, he climbed up and held the ladder step. The rancher rode to the widow's homestead just after sunrise, the valley washed clean by the storm. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings, though he knew nothing in this place came easily. His expression was calm, but his heart was unsettled in a way it had not been for years. Today, he had not come to collect. The widow saw him approaching and stiffened at once. "You don't need to," the rancher replied. "You've already paid more than enough." He gestured toward the horse behind him, where supplies were tied to the saddle: flour, beans, dried meat, blankets. He explained that a pair of goats would arrive later that week, along with seed for the next planting season. He offered to have the roof properly repaired and promised that spring arrived gently in the valley, as if it too had decided to give the widow and her editorial family a second chance. The fields once dull and lifeless now carried faint lines of green where new seeds had taken hold. The goats the rancher sent proved stubborn but generous, providing milk enough for the children and a little extra to trade. The roof no longer leaked, and smoke rose more confidently from the chimney each morning. She smiled, not with gratitude, but with confidence. "We survived," she replied. "Because someone chose kindness."